this is not bad, but what it highlights is outstanding scholars. If you have a child who is an outstanding scholar, if you are an outstanding scholar, you can benefit from an extremely selective school. If you're not, for non-academic pursuits, there's relatively little difference between going to a selective school and a non-selective school. And there's also relatively little difference between costs at good public colleges out of state. So the tuition at North Carolina this year is $24,000. The tuition at Princeton is $36,000. $10,000 to $12,000 is the difference. In state, it's different, but it's important to think about that as well. So, are there any questions up to this point?
What determines an in-state?
Okay, so for the public colleges, the state in which you are a resident, that would be Rutgers, Rutgers, TC for us, those who live in New Jersey, Rutgers, TCNJ, Montclair State, Rowan University, NJIT are in-state colleges that are funded by the state.
Resident for how long? Resident for how long do you apply?
I don't know. I think it's like a year. I mean, you have to make your permanent residence there.
But I think a student who has been there for, I think it's about a year, if they change their permanent residence, they'll start getting.
Yeah, there are states, for example, California, where if you change your permanent residence to that state, you can get in-state tuition rates. However, they're cracking down on that in California right now.
Maryland has a requirement that you need to file a tax return for 1 year.
Right.
Prove that you're working.
Right.
For in-state.
Right.
So you can basically move the previous year to that California.
Yeah, you have to plan ahead.
Right. Right. So there are people, there are people who I know who've chosen to live in states like Virginia because they know that there are very good public universities there. So let's start off by talking about the most selective research universities. What do you get from that? Well, first of all, one thing I want to emphasize is that the most selective research universities is, we'll talk about what these are in a minute, the financial aid is often very good. It can be cheaper to send your kid to Princeton than it is to send them to Rutgers, depending on your income level. It's very, very much determined by income level. If you're at one of these universities, many, though by no means all, students are passionate about learning. The fraction of students who are really passionate about learning tends to be higher. The way I know this is I talk to my colleagues at other institutions in my field. And I know that in my classes, the undergraduates often outcompete the graduate students. My best undergraduates, every year I have an undergraduate who will beat out most of the graduate, or even all of the graduate students on a couple of assignments. And about half of the undergraduates, I'd say, are like that. And I go to other colleges and the professors are talking, well, how do you get the kids interested in learning? I do not have this problem. So again, if you are passionate about learning, then it makes sense. If you have a child who's passionate about learning, it makes sense to think about some of the more selective schools. However, these are upsides. There's a downside. And the downside is that at what we call Research One universities, which includes Rutgers and Maryland, incidentally, faculty are often research focused. And what that means is that I'm taking a job at Johns Hopkins University. They're giving me a tenured position. They didn't ask to see my teaching evaluations before I took that position. They're asking for them when I go up for tenure. But they were willing to offer me potentially a full professorship without knowing whether I could teach or not. That's what they care about is, do you do good research? Are you a scholar? And the assumption is that if you care enough about the subject, that you'll be able to pass that on somehow. Maybe by smoke signals or something. It doesn't always work. Okay, some of the worst teaching I've ever had was at Princeton. Some of the best teaching I ever had was at Princeton. And the other thing is that the most selective private research universities make a lot of resources available to students. A lot. I'll give you an example. When I was an undergraduate, I worked at the lab where I work now, and I ran a climate model. My first publication in the field came out of work that I did as an undergraduate. My wife at the same university got to work with one of the founders of the field of cognitive science. My advisor for my senior independent work is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. See, that's the kind of thing that you can get as an undergraduate at a selective research university. So here's some examples. And what I'm going to do when I get these examples is put the ones in green, and the ones in green are not a seal of approval for me. These are places where I have colleagues, or I have had graduate students, or my program has had graduate students apply that we were really excited about. Okay? So this is not an exhaustive list, but if you take the Ivy League, Penn, Princeton, Columbia, Cornell, Dartmouth, Yale, Brown, and Harvard, you can see that there's an awful lot of those that are in green. Chicago, Northwestern, Stanford, MIT, Caltech, Johns Hopkins, Duke, Rice, Georgetown, Emory, all of these are top-rate schools. If I got an A student from any of those as an applicant for graduate school, I would be overjoyed. And in many cases, I have colleagues in there. Okay. So those are private research universities. Now what about the public research universities? As I said before, these are somewhat less expensive for out-of-state students. They're much less expensive in state. The ones I put here because I think they also fit the bill for what you find at the private research universities, that many of the students are really passionate about learning. And that's because in many of these states, most of the really good students go to those schools. Again, at these schools, the faculties are often research-focused. They're not chosen for excellence in teaching. At a large public university, you are more likely to get multiple-choice tests rather than essays. You are more likely to get graduate students teaching courses. That tends to happen somewhat less, especially these days, at the private research, the elite private research universities. They do try to have, I had no courses that were taught by a graduate student in my undergraduate career. One of the things there is they tend to have larger classes and a little less individualized attention. There are an amazing amount of resources available to students, in some cases more than the private research universities. These schools tend to be bigger, and so they have a lot more to offer, but you often have to go and look for them. So examples I put here are Berkeley and UCSD in Michigan, Wisconsin, Virginia, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Indiana, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. These are all programs where they have departments that are in the top 10 national, and multiple departments. These are the schools that public universities aspire to try to get to this level. Another thing is that they tend to have strong engineering and pre-professional programs, in many cases stronger than private research universities. For example, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, as an engineering school, ranks ahead of Princeton. Third class of colleges are what I call selective small liberal arts colleges. These would be schools that generally accept less than 50% of their applicants, sometimes much less than 50%. Often they also have very good financial aid. Williams College in Massachusetts is an example. They have $1 billion endowment, which means they spend they draw $40 to $50 million from that every year, and much of that goes to financial aid. Again, you get a lot of students who are passionate about learning. The difference is the faculty is more focused on teaching. At the liberal arts colleges, you are actually judged on your teaching. At a place like Princeton or Johns Hopkins, if you're a bad teacher, it will count against you in tenure. If you're a really bad teacher, you may even not get tenure. But these places actually care about your teaching, and they demand good teaching from their professors. It's no accident, I think, that a lot of women in science tend to come out of the small liberal arts colleges. So resources are very high quality, but often there's a little less variety. They are small. Most of these are in the 1,000 to 2,000 student range. For example, many of them don't offer engineering. So examples I've given here are Williams, Swarthmore, Harvard, Bowdoin, Mount Holyoke, Wellesley, Oberlin, which is in Ohio, Kenyon in Ohio, Reed in Oregon, Middlebury in Vermont, Olin, which is a new engineering college in Massachusetts, and really very impressive. Wesleyan Harvey Mudd, which is in California and is one of the best undergraduate science liberal arts colleges in the country, and Bucknell in Pennsylvania. So these are schools that, again, might want to have on your radars for good students. So Molly's going to address this in more detail, but I just want to reemphasize this point. The highly selective colleges are putting a fair amount of resources into their students. And so one of the things that you're going to want to ask is, if you're applying to one of these colleges, they're going to put $80,000 to $250,000 into your education. Are you a good risk? Is there any evidence that you're a good risk? And for parents, that's the question that you should be looking at, with your kids. Are you someone who's motivated to seek out excellence, and do you care about more than just grades? And Molly's going to talk about this a little bit more, but I just want to emphasize that that's one of the reasons that the selective colleges are hard to get into, because that's the question they're asking. So, then I think there's a next tier of colleges, and why do I call them the next tier? I think that for those colleges, one of the following may be true. Often the student body is somewhat less competitive. As research universities, they may be less at the forefront of the field, but as I said, possibly strong in some areas. My wife's an example. University of Massachusetts Amherst was rated the #1 linguistics department in the country when she was in graduate school. But in a lot of fields, it's not top 10 or top 20. Princeton is, I think, in top 20 in 25 different departments. UMass was top 20 in 3. They tend to be much less individualized attention. One of my friends from actually you met Peter Noonan, when he was doing student ministry on the UMass campus, said that a student had come up to him and said, well, when I first got to UMass, I felt like I was just a number. And he said, oh yeah, but expecting that he would say that he found his place. And then said the student, I got used to it. Okay. That's a fact for a lot of these colleges, and it may make them a less good of a fit for certain students, which we'll talk about later. They tend to devote less research. Some of these will tend to devote less research to resources to undergraduates. Now, not all of these are necessarily true for this next tier, but often one or two of them may. And one thing I want to emphasize is that you can get an excellent education at all of the schools. You just may have to work a little harder at it. And that may be an issue for some students. And the average student, I would say, at these schools is less challenged than the average student at the most selective ones. So what I would put on this next tier. The private universities, Boston College, Villanova, Boston University, Drew, Tufts, University of Rochester, a lot of these are really pretty good schools. Okay, these are still fair, these are good schools, a lot of them. Public universities, Maryland, Rutgers, Penn State. You'll notice I've got little green marks here. Probably one of the best young scientists in my lab, the one who I think is the most likely to make it to the National Academy, is a Rutgers graduate. And so, he'll make it to the National Academy before I will. And then small colleges, Colgate, Colby, Trinity, Washington, Lee, Hope, Gordon, and Calvin. Hope and Calvin are in Michigan, Gordon's in Massachusetts. And again, I put Colgate on this list because it's a pretty good school, and yet my friends who teach there say, yeah, how do you get the students motivated to actually be excited? So some of these it's a pretty good school for a B student. And then teachers' colleges, TCNJ, Rowan, and Montclair State. TCNJ is actually a better school than Rutgers in terms of its average student profile. And it's got a good pre-med program. It doesn't offer very much financial aid, but it's a good school.